Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 9, where we will be covering chapter 8, which is social influence. I just want to apologize if you hear a piano in the background. That'd be my son practicing. Hopefully, this recording comes across good and you don't have any trouble hearing it. So, this week we're going to be covering the area of social influence. It's one of the more popular topics of social psychology. This is actually kind of the area where social psychology first took its place. So we're going to be looking at some very seminal research by people that you've probably already heard of if you've taken psychology in high school or definitely an intro psych. You're going to be coming across some big names like Phil Zimbardo and Stanley Milgram. But social influence really is powerful because it's all about how we can influence others as well as how others can influence us. And some of that is very direct and some of it's very indirect. It kind of pulls in a lot of social norms and how we get along in society, group dynamics as well. Even though we'll be covering groups in a lot more detail later in the semester, we'll start to get into a little bit of it here. I think you're going to enjoy this chapter. It has a lot to offer. And again, it builds upon some previous material. So if we skip down to the chapter objectives here, we're going to be talking about first social norms. And we're going to be looking at, just how norms function in society. What is their purpose? Why do we have them? What do they do for us? And then we'll be kind of tearing apart the concepts of conformity, compliance, and obedience, as well as symbolic social influence. These are kind of three separate areas involved in social influence. And so these all will be explained in terms of different experiments that were done in each area. So first we'll be starting with Solomon Asch, another really pivotal person in the area of social psychology. And his research was in the subfield of conformity. So he wanted to know, why do people conform to others' behaviors? When do they conform? What situations would bring about more conformity rather than less conformity? And why do we sometimes conform even when we know it's not the right thing to do, or we are pretty sure of our understanding of a situation, yet we'll conform with the majority? We're going to present some of his famous studies in this area, one being the line study that some of you may have already heard of. We'll also be taking a look at the work of Sharif, looking at social norms and how they work in terms of us navigating our social environment. He kind of played off a lot of what Asch kind of laid the groundwork for. So we'll be digging in a little deeper to just what kinds of groups we conform more to. So getting into the size of a group matters when it comes to our conformity, as well as how cohesive a group is. Like, are they close-knit, or is this a group that we don't have strong ties to, is going to affect our conformity. And getting deeper into the different types of norms that we use, descriptive norms and injunctive norms. You'll want to know examples of each. They're just different types of norms that operate out in the world that we use to dictate our decision making. They play different relevance on us in terms of what we decide we're going to be doing. And it matters too who they're coming from. Okay, so who's sort of establishing these norms. And then we'll go into looking at, why do social norms persist? Like, what do they do for us in society? How do they even change over time? depending upon our culture or our subculture. And then looking at some reasons why sometimes people do not conform. Is it because of stubbornness, or do people sometimes have really good reasons for not conforming? What does it take to withstand conformity, especially in situations where conforming is not good, where we're conforming out of blind obedience, sort of just kind of going along with the crowd and not using sort of our own decision-making process, sort of being divorced from decision-making and relying on the opinions and judgments of others to dictate our actions. Here's where we start to get into emotional contagion and when the minority can actually influence the majority. We'll also take a look at some sex differences in conformity. Not all conformity looks the same. It does matter. Gender plays a key factor, and that's just because of our culture and how gender is cultured in our society. Then we'll turn to compliance. And so this is largely the area of Robert Cialdini, looking at how do we get people to do what we want, the principles of compliance. And here's where we piggyback a little bit on the area of persuasion. There are tactics and things that we can do when we're trying to get somebody to buy a product or agree with a request or go along with something that we are doing. So we'll take a look at that. And then lastly, we'll get into the area of obedience research. And this is Stanley Milgram's famous shock study. And we'll be taking a look at when do we obey, who do we obey, why do we obey, all the factors involved in obedience, what brings about more obedience than not. Are there particular settings or environmental variables that would dictate one would obey more so than other settings or environments? Are there different factors about the person? Typically, when we talk about obedience, we're talking about obeying authority figures. Who is an authority figure that we would obey and why? Who has the power as an authority figure? What does that look like? So that's all embedded within the research of Milgram, which you're going to find here in the chapter, and you're going to find it in the extra reading this week, and you're going to find it in some of the videos that you will be watching. And then lastly, we'll talk about destructive obedience. Obedience is good when we're obeying just authority figures, righteous, very justice-driven authority figures. Obedience is not good when we are obeying people who are abusing their power, when we feel compelled to obey in that regard. Okay, so here are your lecture slides. We're going to do a couple videos here that deal with social norms. And this one's emotional branding, which is very key in marketing and advertising. And it gets into persuasion tactics and some of the principles of compliance that you'll be reading about with Cialdini. And so this is a PBS Frontline video about emotional branding, how our emotions are often tied to our decision making, especially when it comes to products, consumerism. So we'll take a look at that. Then we have Ash's famous conformity experiment. This is a very quick video of his line experiment. You'll also be taking a look at a video from, I believe this is from Khan Academy. It talks about conformity and groupthink. The groupthink part we'll get more into when we cover that in chapter 11, but you'll want to be watching the first half of the video that deals with conformity. Groupthink plays off of conformity, so it's kind of like we have to build up to it to understand groupthink. You have to understand why one conforms. So you'll be taking a look at the first half of that video on conformity. You'll also be watching I think there's a video clip in the reading, so embedded within the chapter is a video on the Milgram study. But you'll also be reading about it this week in your extra article reading. So you want to make sure you do that first before you watch this, which is a modern day take on the Milgram study. So again, you want to read Article 26. That is the famous Milgram study before you watch the videos. And you should always be doing the reading before you watch the videos. The videos are meant to further illustrate the concepts that you're learning in the reading. Okay. So the Jerry Berger study is a more modern take on the Milgram study. They sort of recreated the experiments today, and the results are surprising. And so I'll leave it at that, but you're going to want to watch that. It is tied to your discussion post for the week. You'll be talking about sort of what was found in the modern day take on the study. And then lastly, you'll be watching a short video clip on the Abu Ghraib prison atrocity, which deals with conformity and obedience at its worst. Okay, so here's a great example of what can go wrong when one obeys unjust authority. Okay, so those are all the videos aside from the ones that you'll be watching within the chapters in Revel. And then your discussion question this week is going to require you to tie in Chapter 8 and tie in the article reading, which is about the Milgram study, to answer the following questions. What do we know from the Milgram study about obedience? Talking about what factors play a role in people obeying when they aren't sure they should. Like what compels people to obey when they know that maybe they shouldn't. What was specifically found in the Milgram study that showed people were more likely to obey, like what factors were present that made people feel like they had to obey. Okay. And then the second part is what implications do these findings have for the real world? Thinking about a situation like the Abu Ghraib prison atrocity, that's a real world example of just how obedience can go awry when you have people committing atrocities against humanity. And in particular, when we talk about obedience, one of the first things people think of is the military, right? Which is an organization that operates on obedience. And it needs to. Otherwise, the military would not be effective in defending our country. Obedience is necessary to the utmost degree. But so what could military leaders do, knowing that sometimes obedience can go haywire and you get people in wrong positions that are not just people, and they're in leadership positions of power and people are following them? Is there anything that we could learn from the research, from the studies, that might help the military in particular avoid future instances like the Abu Ghraib prison atrocity? Okay, so there's where you have a chance to really tie in all the resources this week, all the readings and the videos, give some of what you think, but also you're basing all of this on the research. So I really want to see that come out in your answers in your discussion post this week. All right, and then lastly, you're going to have exam 4, which covers chapters 7 and 8, so interpersonal relationships as well as social influence. And that wraps up week 9. Please let me know. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or stop by and see me. Thanks, everyone.